present to you the Asian Development Bank's annual outlook. And this year it focuses on the energy challenge. Energy, natural resources seem to be extremely fundamental to the development prospects of not only Asia, but Europe, Africa, almost all the major economic centers on the globe. We'll be focusing naturally on the ADB's constituency, its region. It's also our region because most of the European members, the EU members, are also participants or how do you call them, contributors to the Asian Development Bank. I think it's something that's frequently overlooked. But anyway, I'll try to make this very short. I've been reminded that we have other functions coming up very soon, the 24th in our cycle of political leadership changes in Asia. We'll have one on Japan leadership change on the 24th. On the 26th, we have one on the Korean leadership change. So please think about coming. We'll have others also because there are a lot of elections in Asia this year. It's only part of our agenda. We have other activities pertaining to politics, strategic issues, and political economic issues. And this is where this fits in, and I'll be brief and end my presentation, although I had seen a paper by a friend from Leeds University, Christopher Dent, on energy diplomacy, which might have been suitable to introduce this topic, but I think I'll get right into it and present our keynote speaker, Joseph Zveglich, Assistant Chief Economist at the ADB, and he'll make the first presentation, and then I'll present the other panelists as they come up. Thank you.
I've been reminded by my colleagues to point out that we do have copies of the highlights, which include a CD of the complete report. In addition, this was the launch version of the report that's currently in the highlights. We're working very hard to update for the final print version, which will also be on our website. This version is on our website now, but we will have a new version on our website within the next few weeks. The main difference being that all of the charts that are in the main report, the data will be embedded. So if anyone wants to get the data for any purpose, the report will include all of that. I'd like to begin just by giving us a sense of what we mean by developing Asia. These are all of the developing member countries of the Asian Development Bank. As mentioned, we have also our non-regional members, such as much of the EU, who are part of our essentially the bank's owners, as well as donors to our concessional funds. But within the region, developing Asia spans the Pacific Island economies, but goes as far west as the Southern Caucasus countries of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. We include the three of the four largest countries in the world, China, Indonesia, and India, but also many of the smallest, like Nauru and Vanuatu in the Pacific. So it's a very diverse region. Our ADO comes out twice a year. The main report in April, March or April, and then an update that will come out in September, October. And I was very pleased to see that on the shelf of documents was past copies of the ADO, although I notice you're missing the 2011 versions, so hopefully our Frankfurt office can fill the gap there with that once we're finished. So let me see. I've got a pointer, a microphone, and a pile of speaking notes. Let's see how well I can juggle all of this. Let me start with what I'll do is I'll go very quickly through the outlook part of our report, just to give you a sense of the background of where we are when we're thinking about Asia's energy challenge. So the key findings of the report: developing Asia is bouncing back from its slowdown of the previous year. Growth will accelerate to 6.6% and 6.7% in 2014, and this is up from 6.1% last year. Robust domestic demand supported the rebound in China, and greater reliance on regional trade is buttressing the resilience in the ASEAN group of countries. And both of these factors have supported the region's pickup generally. Inflation is still under control, though it's expected to rise from 3.7% to 4% and 4.2%. However, price pressures are building up as the region's economies return to their production potential and as the advanced economies continue their unconventional monetary policies that are expanding global liquidity. Developing Asia's prospects remain vulnerable to shocks, though, and here we see a number of risks that are beyond the economic sphere and into the sphere of politics in the U.S., Euro area, and Asia. And finally, the theme chapter, the main point of my presentation: the region needs an ample supply of clean, affordable energy to continue its rapid growth pace. So turning now to the outlook. As I mentioned, developing Asia's growth is picking up from 6.1% last year to 6.6% and 6.7% in the next 2 years. It's notable that the pace of growth that had slowed down to a similar rate as what was experienced at the depth of the global financial crisis. This pickup is despite continued subdued external environment. Collectively, the major industrial economies of the U.S., Euro area, and Japan are anticipated to grow by only 1% this year and 1.9% in 2014. In Asia, growth is being driven by strong domestic demand. Strong private consumption was a common feature across the region. Investment as well contributed significantly to growth in most developing Asian economies last year. And with the strong domestic demand, we see further evidence that Asia is rebalancing towards less reliance on external demand. The large persistent current account surpluses that prevailed before the global financial crisis had reached about 9.5% of the region's GDP in 2007, and we expect them to narrow further from 2% of GDP in 2012 to 1.9 and 1.8% in 2014. This does raise the question of whether this is due to cyclical factors or more structural changes. And looking at individual country prospects, we do see some signs that this is a more structural change and not just because of the continued slowdown. Or to put it another way, because of the expected continued slowdown, Asia has made an adjustment towards a more balanced growth model. The region's giants are showing very different speeds of recovery, though. China will expand by 8.2% in 2013 and 8% next year, compared to 7.8% in 2012. As strong domestic demand continues and export performance is likely to pick up in 2014. India has considerable potential, but its future performance relies on resolving contentious structural issues that inhibit investment. Strong consumption will continue to drive India's growth, though, recovering from 5% in the current fiscal year to 6% next year and 6.5% the year after that. ASEAN is maintaining a very resilient growth. The ASEAN group of countries was the only sub-region that had managed a growth pickup between 2011 and 2012, but this was largely due to the recovery from the floods in Thailand, as well as a recovery in public spending in the Philippines. In addition to the strong domestic demand, larger trade with other regional countries has compensated for soft demand from the major industrial economy. ASEAN's trade within the region is about half of its total now, and this compares with about 42% of its total in the early 2000s. ASEAN's resilience is expected to extend through the forecast horizon, with growth averaging 5.4% and 5.7% in 2014. Inflation does remain in check, although it is picking up somewhat. Inflation is expected to tick up from 3.7% to 4% next year and 4.2% the year after that. But we are seeing that there is potential that inflation pressures may build further. The robust growth experienced in the region for the past few years has essentially eliminated the slack productive capacity that had opened up at the time of the crisis. For these economies, loose domestic demand, loose domestic monetary policy, could risk reigniting inflation. So macroeconomic policy must focus on maintaining stability. So price pressures must be closely monitored in this environment of continued global liquidity expansion. Several countries are already dealing with higher inflation or structural imbalances, and for them, stabilization must be their priority. With the continuation of unconventional monetary policy in advanced economies, the region's policymakers must also watch cross-border financial transactions to protect banking sector soundness, and where necessary, macroprudential policies must be strengthened. Our Asian Bond Market Monitor, which is another of ADB's publications, had noted that along with the capital inflows which had picked up, foreign currency borrowing is also on the increase, and this further emphasizes the need for vigilance, as it was the foreign currency borrowing for long-term domestic investment that was one of the weaknesses at the time of the Asian financial crisis. The focus of fiscal policy, though, should be a shift towards supporting long-term structural change for inclusive growth. Governments should prioritize financing longer-term public investments and ensuring the efficient delivery of public goods, while making revenue mobilization more effective to maintain a healthy fiscal balance. Political risks in many forms could potentially undermine the forecasts. Although the probability of a U.S. fiscal shock or a euro area breakdown, which were the main risks we had highlighted in 2012, have faded, political contention is calling into question the ability of authorities to find compromise solutions to a range of contentious problems. In the U.S., political wrangling over the debt ceiling remains likely, reprising the brinkmanship that in 2012 had pummeled global financial markets. Austerity fatigue in the euro area could undermine the political support needed to continue moving vulnerable countries' sovereign debt back onto a sustainable path. And finally, border disputes in Asia had spilled over to the economic arena in 2012. The heated rhetoric has since cooled, but could be reignited for political gain. Finally, geopolitical risks in oil-producing countries could shock prices for this critical commodity, which would spill over to the region's inflation and undermine growth. Risks to international oil prices could be increasingly important to developing Asia. With its rising prominence in the global economy, developing Asia has become a major player in global commodity markets. Asia's resilient growth has made it a heavyweight in markets for agriculture, metals, and energy commodities. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude, if we look only at China's consumption, China produces 23% of global agricultural crops, 40% of base metals, and 20% of non-renewable energy sources. And the region's energy needs are set to expand further alongside this growth, such that price volatility from geopolitical risks in the Middle East could further would be even a greater vulnerability that the region would face. So looking past the short-term issue, though, developing Asia's sustainable growth will depend critically on securing adequate energy supplies. And that brings us to the theme chapter. Developing Asia's energy challenge can be characterized along three fronts. It must secure adequate physical supplies in order to maintain the growth it needed to achieve its income and growth aspirations. But scaling up its current energy mix would be devastating to the environment. And finally, for growth to be truly inclusive, the poor must also have affordable access to energy. So the challenge is really to secure physical energy supplies in a way that is environmentally sustainable, but also provides affordable access to the poor. So let me look at each of these aspects in turn. Energy systems are being challenged to satisfy developing Asia's economic aspirations. We had prepared a report called Asia 2050 a few years back. And within that report was a so-called Asian century scenario, where by 2050, developing Asia as a whole was producing over half of the world's output. If we took that idea and then asked the question, what does that imply for the energy needs? Well, if we looked at between now and 2035, at 6% growth, developing Asia would end up producing about 44% of global GDP by 2035. But this would see Asia's share of world energy consumption rise rapidly from about a third today to about 51 to 56% in 2035, depending on what we would assume about energy intensity changes. So without sufficient energy, developing Asia would need to either scale back its growth ambitions. But its current endowment is not enough to support these ambitions. Securing adequate energy is going to be a serious challenge because of this. The region has abundant coal, but currently commands only 16% of world-proven conventional gas reserves and 15% of technically recoverable oil and natural gas liquids. So if we were to maintain business as usual, oil imports would triple by 2035 to fill this gap. They would rise from 11 million barrels per day to more than 30 million barrels per day by 2035. Not only that, without radical changes to the region's energy mix, Asia's consumption of fossil fuels would climb, doubling oil consumption and tripling natural gas consumption. Even highly polluting coal would have to increase by a whopping 80% in order to meet these needs. If this were to happen, without these any changes, this would double carbon dioxide emissions to over 20 billion tons by 2035. So, under this scenario, without any changes, Asia alone would emit almost all of the 22 billion tons of carbon dioxide that climate change experts see as that year's maximum sustainable CO2 emissions from the energy sector for the world as a whole. In addition, Asia is also, it has to be taken into account that Asia is also home to the world's, most of the world's energy poor. Nearly half of the people in the world without access to electricity, and about 79% of the world's population dependent on traditional fuels, live in Asia. Universal access to electricity and clean cooking fuel would have high social and economic returns, but getting connections to people without access would require a 5-fold increase in annual energy investments globally. So the multidimensional challenge of Asia's energy problems of adequate physical supply, environmental sustainability, and affordability are going to demand a multi-pronged response. And this will include that meeting the supply gap in an environmentally sustainable way is going to mean trying to keep Asia's demand growth in check. Inefficient subsidies that distort the price of energy must be removed to encourage more prudent use and reduce fiscal burdens. The worst aspect of these subsidies, these general subsidies on energy, is that although they are justified as support to the poor, it is not the poor who generally benefit. The poor many lack electricity, very few own cars, and most transport sparingly. So Indonesia's effort to replace general subsidies with targeted subsidies is one step in the right direction. In addition, encouraging behavioral change can be a way to reap energy efficiency benefits. If we think of the example of Japan's Setsuden saving electricity movement in last summer post-Fukushima, it was able to lower its peak demand by 15% by essentially putting into place less use of air conditioning in public buildings, less use of lighting, as a way of mobilizing, using moral suasion tactics to mobilize the population to use less electricity. So we should not discount the power of these types of initiatives. But demand-side management alone will not be enough, and Asia needs to expand its energy supplies while ensuring that the future energy mix is a cleaner energy mix. Achieving this depends on tapping new energy sources and technologies, and this includes making greater use of renewables. Asia has gained headway in boosting generating capacity for solar and wind, and there is great potential for further expansion. Asian countries are also among world leaders in the manufacture of solar-powered equipment, and wind and solar are now cost competitive in some remote Asian communities. Hydro is well established in the region, but only 20% of resources have been developed. Tapping the region's hydro potential requires addressing concerns, though, regarding community displacement, loss of agricultural land, and environmental impacts. Asia is not at the moment a major biofuel producer, but new technologies that do not compete with food could bolster biofuels' role in lowering CO2 emissions of Asia's transport sector. However, renewable energy sources, they do have great potential. They are not yet cost competitive. Current generation costs for wind and solar are much higher than traditional energy sources. But forecasts do indicate that the cost of wind power generation could fall by 20 to 30% from its current levels by 2030. Similarly, it's expected that continued solar development can at least halve cost by 2025. But Asia can't and shouldn't wait. Conventional energy has to be made cleaner and more efficient now. One promising source is that shale gas could be used to offset coal use. China has the largest shale gas resources in the world at nearly 20% of total. India and Pakistan are also among the top 20 locations of shale gas reserves. However, technical difficulties like methane leakage and water contamination make extraction problematic. Development on densely populated land could also be challenging. Nevertheless, unconventional gas could provide a cleaner bridge to a future that is less dependent on fossil fuels. For Asia to achieve a brighter energy future, actually, there we go. I'm missing a slide. The nuclear power, as part of the energy solution, in this regard, because ADB is not as an institution investing in nuclear power, we did at least ask the question of what would it mean if we were to remove the nuclear option from the energy mix. If the nuclear power plants were to be essentially allowed to run their current lifespan, but no new nuclear investment was made, Asia's energy sector CO2 emissions would rise by 18 to 13% in 2035. But if Asia is to continue its expansion of nuclear power, it must address the contentious issues of nuclear proliferation, waste management, and post-Fukushima, clearly the safety issue is on everyone's mind. Connecting electricity and gas grid, integrating regional energy markets would multiply the gains of demand and supply changes. Connecting energy and gas grids can create economies of scale that improve efficiency. For example, integrating power transmission in the greater Mekong subregion could save up to $14 billion over 20 years by substituting hydropower for fossil fuels. It would also reduce CO2 emissions by 14 million tons per year by 2020. However, such integration requires political commitment for cooperation and building necessary infrastructure. So, for Asia to achieve a brighter energy future, it must aspire to create a pan-Asian energy market by 2030. As an initial step, and to show leadership at the highest levels, a ministerial task force could be established to study the European experience and promote the political will to share information and harmonize regulations, standards, and pricing policies. Based on country circumstances, Asia must also immediately take concrete steps to curb demand and expand supply of clean, affordable energy. Research and development is going to be crucial to modernizing the region's energy sector. And as part of this, technology transfer from advanced economies to less developed economies will be critical, including transfers of technology from within Asia, from the more advanced economies like China, that have made headway in solar and wind technology, to some of the lower income countries. In the end, because there is no one single solution to the problem, and each potential source of energy has its merits and its shortcomings, every watt counts. So every possible approach is going to have to be considered based on comparative advantage. So let me end here with the key findings. Developing Asia is bouncing back from its slowdown, and the rebound in China and ASEAN's robust growth are playing a role. Inflation is still under control, though it is expected to rise. And developing Asia will need to be aware of political tensions in various guises that could undermine the outlook. And finally, the region needs an ample supply of clean, affordable energy to continue its rapid growth in the coming decades. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. And I enjoyed the presentation. We work closely with the ADB, with their Asia Clean Energy Forum, and in helping support the growth of wind energy and other renewables throughout the region. And I agree with almost everything that it says, but I'll touch on a few points. I'm just going to run quickly through the status of global markets, not because that's necessarily what you're interested in, but just where Asia fits, and then look at some of the projections going forward in some of the key markets, some of the new, very exciting potential markets in Asia, and then draw some conclusions on that. Very briefly, this is we're a global trade association, but a bit of a hybrid in the sense that we represent both the major companies in the sector, but also the national and regional associations. And in this context, that's China, India, Japan, Korea. So if we look at the global totals of investment in clean energy, you see that it's rather dramatic growth over the course of the last 7 or 8 years. The reduction in 2012 is not because less wind and solar power was installed, but because it has in fact become very much cheaper over the course of the last year, particularly in solar. I mean, both the solar and wind numbers were up in 2012, but represented less capital investment. And of most relevance here is the proportion of that which is happening in Asia, which I think probably in about the middle of 2011, Asia eclipsed Europe for the majority of installations, and the gap continues to grow. Asia, you probably can't read this very well, but Asia is the light blue bar at the top. These are all numbers from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Just quickly, the wind sector has gone from not only in China and India, but elsewhere, from virtually negligible to about 20% of all new power installations globally last year, now totaling up about 280 gigawatts, 18%, and the annual market 45 gigawatts installed again. Outside of coal in China, the largest power technology installed on the planet. Top 10 markets, ironically, for all the wrong reasons, the United States eclipsed China in 2012 by about 150 or 160 megawatts for the first time since 2009. But that's as a result of the policy insanity in the United States, which means that it was 13.2 gigawatts in 2012, and if it's a quarter of that in 2013, we'll be lucky. And the Chinese market has undergone some consolidation in the course of the last couple of years, but it still remains very much at the top of the league table with more than 75 gigawatts installed in cumulative capacity. This is the regional breakdown of the distribution of installations. You see in 2010, the Asian market, which is mostly China and India up to now, dominated global installations as opposed to North America and Europe. Again in 2011. And in 2012 it was a bit less, but I'm quite sure that's a very temporary blip, mostly to do with China. Going forward, the market projections, these aren't broken down by region, so they're not of much use, but I will just talk about the projections out to 2017, with the red bar being Asia, and you can see that it is totally dominant in terms of the wind sector going forward. And in cumulative terms, will surpass Europe in terms of total installed capacity, either at the end of 2013 or sometime in the beginning of 2014. And then moving away. So to generalize about Asia is rather difficult, it being a rather large and extremely diverse place, like probably 2/3 of the land surface of the area, and that's in these conversations about Asia we don't include the largest part, of course, which is Russia, but that's another subject altogether. But as the ADB has pointed out, generally poor in fossil resources except for coal, but excruciatingly and exceedingly rich in both wind and solar resources. And the approach that governments have taken, I mean, the renewable energy industry grew in Europe and North America, I wouldn't necessarily say for ideological reasons, but purely political, at least initially motivated through purely political reasons, as well as energy security. But the approach in most of the Asian countries so far is much more pragmatic and driven primarily by energy security and price stability, but also as a means to create new industrial development, and perhaps most importantly, the quickest way to get new generation capacity in the ground is through wind and solar. Very, very fast to deploy. Lead times for a gas plant can be 5 years. For a coal plant can be 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and for nuclear somewhere between 10 and 12, or unless you're in China, which you can do it maybe in 6 or 7 if you're lucky. But with wind and solar in particular, as soon as you get the first turbine in the ground, you can hook it up to the grid, and a large project can be installed in a year or less. The other factor that's come into play, particularly in China, but also in India and Mongolia and other places, is the issue of water. We've read a lot about the water-stressed nature of those places. And the nice thing about wind and solar is that neither requires any significant quantity of fresh water to generate electricity. And that's a particular relevance in one of the markets I'm going to talk about in a minute. In the last 3 years, I think for both wind and solar, Asia has become the primary driver for global growth. And that's mostly China and India. But I believe that is set to change in the sense that, not that it will cease to be the driver of global growth. I think that will only accelerate, but I think it will come from a much more diverse range of markets beyond just China and India. But we can't ignore China. The growth curve there is pretty astronomical, as you can see. And just at the end of last year, it became clear that China, in wind power in China had surpassed nuclear for the first time to be the third energy source in terms of electricity generated in 2012. The wind power potential in China from the commercially exploitable sites, which are not either in cities or on steep slopes or in national parks or in inaccessible areas, is somewhere between 2.5 and 8 times the current total electrical generation demand in the country. So it's not a question of lack of resource, it's a question of creating the infrastructure to actually harness that and get it to the market. And it shouldn't be forgotten that the one area which doesn't get talked about much, where China has been the leader for a long time, is in solar hot water heating, where it still has twice as much installed solar hot water heating capacity as the rest of the world combined. And that continues to move on. So if we look at the projections for growth in the market, they're all reasonably close. This is part of a broader study we do every 2 years, looking at the wind sector broken down according to the IEA regions, which does not overlap exactly with the ADB regions, but we look at China separately, and somewhere between 200 and 300 gigawatts by the end of this year, which would represent, by the end of this decade rather, which would represent somewhere about 5 or 6% of total electricity supply, and then tripling that by 2030, somewhere in that range. If we look at India, it's much more complicated and much more diverse. The central government is not directly in control of the power sector. It's much more broken down by states. In India, driven primarily by Tamil Nadu in the beginning, but now broadening out to include Gujarat, Kerala, and a number of the other southern states in particular. And the federal incentive that did exist has been up until now one of primary interest to people looking for a tax shelter, basically, through the accelerated depreciation, where you can write off the entire investments against a year's earned in 1 year. That incentive has now gone away and is in the process of being replaced by one that's more familiar to people here in Europe and in China, one that's based on an incentive for generation, a generation-based incentive, that's what they call it actually, functionally a feed-in tariff. And that has attracted a new series of investors to the industry, which we think will put it on a much firmer footing going forward. One of the issues has been that, for reasons which I have always failed to understand, the government has always lowballed the projected resource availability in India, saying that the total potential capacity was only about 43 gigawatts, and only 5 gigawatts in Tamil Nadu. When the total installations to Tamil Nadu got to 7 gigawatts, they decided they needed to redo the numbers, so now they say that it's 100. NREL says that it's somewhere between 6 and 10 times that. And they have embarked upon this solar mission to try to develop a domestic solar industry, but in the meantime they have a reasonably strong domestic wind industry, and the government, I think, is going to put together a similar sort of mission. But there needs to be some joined-up thinking at the federal level in order for the Indian energy sector to grow, in extent. There's still chronic power shortages for those who are connected to the grid, and I would believe a very large percentage of the people who do not have access to electricity in your chart would be Indians, as many as half or maybe more. And that's a serious issue that the government needs to attack on a federal level as well as a state level. And until that happens, the growth of the energy sector in general, not just for renewables, is going to be constrained. So these are the projection numbers. Again, India currently gets about 4.5% of its electricity from wind. It could easily more than double by 2020 and triple beyond then. But a number of structural changes. And the most important one probably is that the wind and a lot of the solar generation resources are best in the south, but the southern grid remains isolated from the grid throughout the entire northern half of the country, which is where a very large share of the demand is. And until and unless that situation is rectified, it's going to be difficult to develop these further. OECD Pacific I won't talk about because it's not really in the scope here, except to say that Japan and Korea are now investing heavily on the government side. in a post-Fukushima and post-Copenhagen environment, depending on whether you're from Japan or Korea. And their large companies are looking to be very large players in both offshore wind and solar by the end of this decade. And they're spending enough money, so I believe that it will actually happen. But it's outside the usual market situations that we encounter. Non-OECD Asia, excluding China and India, there's a number of very interesting markets, and I'm just going to run through them here quickly and then focus on one. Taiwan, obvious no-brainer, horrendous air pollution, imports all of its fuels, has reasonable onshore wind resources which are being developed, and excellent offshore resources which it is moving towards. And the same with solar, assuming they can clean up the air sufficiently so that the solar radiation can actually penetrate to the PV panels. Pakistan has been the real surprise over the last couple of years, simply because I never thought anyone would want to invest there. But the government has created the conditions to actually facilitate. We have 100 megawatts spinning now, another 700 megawatts which will come to financial close by the end of this year, and a development plan for 5, 6, 7,000 megawatts over the course of the next decade or so, which, assuming the government can deal with the security situation, it's mostly in the southeast and then again in the southwest, so it's not the most dangerous part of the country, but suffice it to say that the construction crews all have to live sequestered and go to and from the sites in armored vehicles and live in special compounds, but still, it's a very positive development. The Philippines, yeah, you talk about some of the structural problems. I won't go into the details. They have a tremendous wind energy resource and a solar energy resource. They have other structural problems which are getting in the way. Some of those are getting dealt with. Others seem to be chronic. Vietnam, excellent resource, but as in so many other new markets in developing countries, the government has a hard time letting the private sector in on the power business. It has been something which has been the exclusive province of the state for so long. There's a difficult adjustment period which we are going through now, and Vietnam is growing quickly. It needs the power. It has excellent wind resources. It's cheaper than a lot of the other options that it could go for, and certainly faster to deploy, but we and they need to figure out a way to actually work productively together, which is not easier. Mongolia I want to talk about a little bit, because it's such a small economy, it doesn't really make your charts, but they have been GDP growth. I looked in your numbers here. It's, well, double digits for the last 3 years, set to increase even more so with the largest mining project, some say the largest engineering project humans have ever undertaken in terms of the mining operations that are being talked about in the southern Gobi Desert. And you're talking about a country with a total installed electrical generation capacity of 800 megawatts, with no roads, no water, and no power. Something has to change. Building thermal generation to supply that operation doesn't really work if you're out in the desert with no means of cooling your steam turbine or supplying it. And the government is very keen on developing renewables. Wind energy potential, 1,100 gigawatts at a conservative estimate of the wind energy potential in the southern part of the country, which is approximately equivalent to the entire total installed generation capacity in China today. And again, we believe that's conservative. Solar of a similar magnitude, enormous quantities of potential generation. And if you combine the two, the output could be in the vicinity of the total generation capacity projected in 2030 by the IEA for all of Asia. Now, granted, that's in a country of 2.4 million people, 600,000 or 700,000, which are still nomadic herders, but there are some very large investors and visionary people who are looking at this potential resource and trying to figure out how to get it to market, which include the second richest man in Japan, Masayoshi Son, who has set up this Japan Renewable Energy Foundation. He's the fellow who broke the back of the telecoms monopoly. So if you go to Japan nowadays and switch on your mobile phone, you'll notice two things. One is that it works, which it never did up until about 4 or 5 years ago. And secondly, that you're most likely to get a logo called Sunbank come up. And he has invested a lot of his own money in helping to move Japan towards a renewable energy future. And part of it is to invest in exploiting Mongolia's resources and trying to figure out how to get them to market. The consortium they put together now includes, of course, the government of Mongolia, the Korean Electric Power Company, who is very interested in this, and one of the big 5 Chinese utilities, who has now finally consented to throw a cable across the border from Inner Mongolia to help finance to help power some of the early stages of the mining operations in the southern Gobi Desert. And their vision, just before I get to their vision, just to talk about the projections, they're all over the place for non-OECD Asia, because, excluding China and India, because there are so many variables. The potential is enormous, but it's a bit of a long shot from where we are. But the vision is something they call the East Asia supergrid, with the primary objective in the initial stage of getting the tremendous resources in Mongolia to markets in China, but also Japan and Korea, at least in the initial stage. Some of the stuff in the lower left-hand side of things looks a bit fanciful to me. It sort of forgets that you have something called the Himalayas in between, which might propose a bit of a logistical challenge. But at least the part of it that I think that is critically interesting at first is the connections to Japan, both going through China, where the grid infrastructure is in place. It needs to be reinforced. There are already got two plans actually, to build a cable across from China to Korea, and there is an existing study which is looking at connecting Korea up with Japan. Going north through Russia over to Vladivostok and coming down the other side to the northern island of Hokkaido is a bit more of a stretch, but the Mongolians are trapped between the two of the largest countries in the world. They are completely dependent upon the Russians for all of their backup electricity, for all of their diesel, for all of their gas, and they really, really, really don't like the Russians. But they like the Chinese even less. So every time they do something, they have to balance it. And so if this thing gets going in terms of substantial interconnection with China to facilitate the renewables development in Mongolia, they're going to have to give the Russians something. And if the Russians could get a market for selling their electricity and interconnecting with Hokkaido, that could have all sorts of benefits, including perhaps diffusing some of the silly tension that goes on between Japan and Russia over the Kurils. It's not only the South China Sea where you have these border issues which have been simmering for many, many decades. And the interesting thing for me is the extent to which the people who talk about this talk about, the European Union started basically as an energy union, coal, steel, and whatever else it was, back in the 40s and 50s, and they're taking that as a model. I mean, we haven't had a big war here for 60, 70 years. They really, really don't want a big war there, and the more mutual interdependence that you can do and revel in and get cheaper and more reliable and cleaner electricity for everyone in the process. It's an early stage, but I think it has some potential to really make a big difference and help to unlock some of the tremendous resources in the continent. So,
let me start by mentioning, of course, that access to secure, sustainable, and affordable energy, as already been pointed out earlier today, has an important role for economic development. It's a key driver for poverty eradication and for inclusive growth. And of course, it's crucial for the countries in the Asian region. For Asia, though, realizing this objective of sustainable, secure, and affordable energy means that they have to deal with the energy challenges, the growing demand, the infrastructure investments that are needed to keep ahead of it, the security of supply questions, particularly in oil, where Asia is quite reliant on the Middle East as a supply region, the concerns of sustainability of energy mix, and of course the question of energy subsidies. Well, why does it matter for the EU? EU obviously is not a self-contained energy system, so what happens elsewhere has direct implications for us. And Asia, of course, is driving quite an impressive transformation in the global energy markets. First of all, well, the rapid rapidly growing demand means that the Asian economies are becoming fossil fuels competitors to Europe as well. We've already heard today some of the numbers of the tremendous increase of being accounting for about a third of energy world consumption to potentially going to over 50 on the business as usual cases. And the estimations of the International Energy Agency point out that China alone will account for approximately 33% of the global energy demand growth. To meet this increased demand, imports will need to happen. On the other hand, EU now accounts for about a sixth of world energy demand, and that share will go down. We also see less and less opportunities for domestic production of fossil fuels, so therefore Europe itself will also be importing more. Today we already import more than 60% of gas and more than 80% of oil, and that share will continue to rise. So in a nutshell, Europe will count more and less, and Asia will count more and more. And for us, it clearly poses a challenge of remaining an attractive market for energy suppliers. Secondly, despite Europe's role and efforts to trigger effective international action on climate change, our own efforts in Europe will mean little if fossil fuels energy consumption and related greenhouse gas emissions grow unabated elsewhere. The EU accounts for 11% of global emissions today, and according to forecasts, only 4% in 2030. As we heard already, without a change in Asia's energy path, Asia's emissions will overtake the world. And there's a huge potential to address that. Well, first of all, energy efficiency is the cleanest and cheapest source of energy, as my bosses like to note in their presentation. And it hasn't been tapped extensively in Asian countries. It's not an easy subject. In the EU, we're also struggling to how to promote energy efficiency. But the technology is largely available. Yes, investments are required up front, but they can actually quite quickly be recouped. We just heard about the potential for renewable energy, which is of course important, but I would like to also mention the role of natural gas, particularly when it comes to replacing coal in power generation. And the US in the last few years actually have demonstrated that where natural gas replaces coal in power generation, some substantial greenhouse savings can be realized. Of course, nuclear is always very tricky. It is still a part of low carbon options for some of the countries in the region, but viability of this energy source, both in Asia but globally in general, will depend on high standards of safety, security, and non-proliferation. The third point comes back a little bit to the world's resources. In addition to environmental benefits of efficient use of resources in Asia, it also actually means potential economic benefits for those countries that are exporters. That is to say, if they use energy more efficiently, the exporting countries will have more energy available to supply the market, and perhaps Europe directly. And here Central Asia comes in mind particularly. It has abundant fossil and other energy resources, and it has the potential to make a significant contribution to the world energy security. Higher exports of oil and gas, which by international standards in that region are fairly low cost actually, would reduce the need for the world to develop resources elsewhere, and would also result in lower global energy prices. And these supplies would increase diversity for energy importers such as Europe. But this subregion, of course, is highly CO2 intensive, so its potential contribution will depend on domestic energy reforms and market trends. Fourthly is a more general point on free and competitive trade flows and secure regulatory frameworks that promote investment. This is a key way to contribute to efficient functioning of the markets. And if Asia addresses its energy security through that, the world and Europe benefits as well. I've mentioned that Europe and Asia may be potential competitors, but we of course have a clear interest in cooperating. Some of the energy security challenges we have today are better addressed in a cooperative way, be it on regional level or global level. And in fact, EU strategy on external energy policy clearly recognizes that need to actively cooperate with key consuming countries, particularly in the areas of sustainable energy policies, research, standardization, and improving the general functioning of the world markets. Also, as a major donor and investor, which is willing to support energy reform in third countries, we're uniquely placed to provide assistance to development and least developed countries. And energy, of course, is fully incorporated in our development policies and external assistance programs. We've heard already some of the possible strategies for Asia to address its demand. It's, of course, diversification of energy mix. It's emergency planning mechanisms to deal with some of the security of supply issues. It's the creation of regional networks to provide flexibility and resilience of the markets. It's reforming absolutely subsidy regimes in a way that also addresses the problem of the most vulnerable customers. And it's important to also provide a stable policy framework with the right incentive of investment, particularly from the private sector. In many of these areas, such as, for example, on integration of energy markets, Europe has, of course, extensive regulatory experience, or these are also the issues that we're trying to deal with at the same time. And to show where we work, I just want to give a few examples. With China, for example, we have a wide-ranging cooperation on a number of issues, and we are now starting to advance on energy security issues, which is a fairly new development, I would say, in the last few years. Last year, we held a high-level meeting on energy in the presence of 27 energy ministers from the EU, and also all the relevant ministers from the were ministers of their representatives from the Chinese side. At that particular occasion, we signed a EU-China energy security declaration, which tries to promote this cooperation. We have identified a large number of possible cooperative actions, and some of them, for example, include the development of the gas market, where, of course, China is looking at now clearly, be it norms, procedures, quality of gas, rules on quality of gas storage issues, gas security of supply, where Europe, again, has done quite a lot. We're also going to be, and already are, looking closely at regulation and management of the electricity sector, which is another issue China is looking at closely, and stability of grids, where with the introduction of renewable energy in Europe, this is also a question we're looking at carefully. With India, our cooperation takes place through EU-India Energy Panel. It's a high-level framework for this energy cooperation. And there, the issues we look at are particularly development and deployment of clean coal technologies, energy efficiency, be it for products through standard-setting methodologies, performance levels, labeling, but also regulatory framework on energy efficiency in buildings in particular. Development of smart power grids and integration of renewable energy is another areas of our focus. With Central Asia, of course, given the European efforts to open a direct access to the energy resources in that region, most people think that this is all that we focus on. And indeed, opening up the Southern Gas Corridor is a key strategy or key strategic priority for European Union. However, our cooperation goes beyond that. We have memoranda of understanding with a number of countries in the region which outline areas for broad cooperation, including on energy sector reform and sustainable energy development. And this cooperation is also supported through a number of mechanism and financing programs, including the Innovate Regional Program that targets issues like sustainable energy development, energy efficiency, but also energy market convergence. I think I will stop here. In sum, I just want to say that, of course, energy transformation has important implication in energy terms, but also sustainable and inclusive economic development in Asia has important implications for us from a political, strategic, and development perspectives. Thank you.
And I'm of course very pleased to speak in this forum. Just trying to get the micro setting. I will not have a very long presentation. In fact, we are a Brussels-based organization, as has already been mentioned. Well, I start with presenting this slide here, which normally is at the end of the presentations, because when people associate energy and Brussels, they don't immediately think of our organization, because of course in Brussels you have many other very important energy actors, especially of course our friends from the European Commission, who have in the past decades have a lot of activity in the energy field. So just to remember that we are also located here in Brussels, and in fact we are from the constituency, we are much larger than the European Union. We are practically twice as large. We have very important countries. You see in blue our members, and then the observers who have signed the Charter of 1991. And then the other observers who are invited up to now. We have originally been born in 1991. We have been known as the European Energy Charter. And in fact, we were based upon in a declaration, political declaration of 1991, where the member countries of the original constituency have come together. That was just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, trying to set up a framework for all these countries which have become newly independent. We had 14 new countries emerging, and there was a lot of political insecurity, what would happen, and so on. So we were the first ones sort of to come, even in 1991, to be sort of set up as a forum. And at that time it was agreed that we should be a forum to implement certain principles, and these principles are briefly mentioned here. So of course the energy security already at the time was a very important principle, and I think that it has kept all its actuality even today. As has been mentioned already before, we feel it also that this can be seen as the cheapest energy source. Then, of course, energy security has been important important factor all along, because this region has been sort of the platform of a lot of geopolitical changes in the last 20 years. But also it was stressed that we should enhance the safety and minimizing the environmental problems, and that we should also develop more efficient energy markets, which at that time were nowhere, not even in Europe. There was before the common market, and that of course the essential thing, last but not least, is that we should create a climate which is favorable for both the enterprises and for the flow of investments and for technologies, because the state sector, of course, on its own would never be have enough resources to handle all the upcoming problems on its own. So the treaty, the protocol, the charter, the political charter was followed in 1994 by a treaty and a protocol. And here I briefly recall what are the content of the treaty. So we have now more than 50 members. We have in fact our last member who just joined us was Afghanistan a few weeks ago as a 54th member. We are open to any exporting or transit or importing countries. We have really a very heterogeneous constituency, much more heterogeneous than practically any other international energy organization having binding provisions of the world. even the International Energy Forum, which is a big forum, but they have no binding provisions. It's simply a forum for political dialogue. But we have a lot of provisions now in the treaty. In our treaty, we stress very much the national sovereignty over energy resources. We leave to the countries the choice to say when they can exploit which resources, at what conditions. Simply, what of course is important for us is that if they allow investors to come in, then these investments should be first of all protected. So we have a very strong energy investment protection provisions in the treaty, and it should be of course based on non-discrimination, because we do not make discrimination on country basis. Then the other aspect, developing the markets. Of course, in the 1991, it was still the time of the GATT. There was no WTO. So they thought of putting into the treaty the essential provisions of what GATT maintained at the moment, which is practically all what concerns really the basic energy security aspects. That is the free trade of flows, the the basic provisions, non-discrimination, the MFN, the national treatment, the elimination of quantitative restrictions you have in GATT, and then in a trade amendment that was adapted to the WTO framework, which is now in work in force. This is why we call it WTO. Then we have, together with that, also investor-to-state and state-to-state dispute settlement procedures. I think the Energy Charter has come known in some circles as quite a strong treaty where investors they have quite a good instrument to initiate disputes settlement procedures against host states when they are being retroactively impaired by measures of the government. Then further to that, and that was a great novelty in 1991, we have a protocol on environmental aspects. That protocol is the basis for what we do today in all the framework of energy efficiency, which I will detail in a moment. And then in the later moments, we have also developed a series of model agreements facilitating the construction of cross-border infrastructure of all types. We have gas, oil, and also for electricity. We have model agreements which reflect the highest state-of-the-art sort of choose and pick provisions which are compatible with our treaty, so that all the actors in all the industrialists acting in our constituency, that they can use from these model agreements in order to implement concretely the concrete agreements they want to have. I will not go very strongly into some of the materials, material data which we have already heard from more competent speakers than myself this morning. Of course, population is very important, a very important key driver for economic growth, and also the GDP growth has already been mentioned already this morning. Also, we are going forward to very strong figures. Asian growth is higher than world average growth. So this, of course, needs all energy. It will fuel energy demand, and this is practically what we are talking about today's session. So, for the meeting all these demand in Asia, of course, we know that the investments are huge. Is billions per year in order to satisfy the energy demand, and of course, especially the demand in clean energy is rising and have been rising and will also rise further in the next few years and decades, and that. The finance, project finance is important, but project finance, the ODA or other financial instruments are not enough to resolve all these problems. We need to have the private sector coming in. So the private sector, in order to come in, needs the right policy and regulatory framework to secure the investments. For this is precisely what we are trying to do in our treaty, in our organization, where we create common rules for global energy security. So this is what we do mainly. Now I have a word about the modernization of the Energy Charter and what it also means for Asia. First of all, our constituents have decided that the membership as it stands now, mainly Eurasia and Australia and Japan, is not enough for the organization, that we would merit to have more members. So we have a membership enlargement program, especially to East Asia and to Southeast Asia, and also to Northern Africa, where we have in these regions where we undertake big efforts to attract new countries, and we have started cooperation with many of them. Then in the framework of the modernization, we also enhance cooperation with other international organizations who do work which is very similar to ours, and we piece by piece and point by point look how we can cooperate. We have at this moment we have about 20 organizations with whom we cooperate on different areas. It has also been decided to update our political mandate, which and that we should more clearly become visible in the sustainability policy and in the low carbon area. We have made a comprehensive assessment of our treaty for low carbon technologies and to see what it can bring, and it has been stressed also that some of the subjects could very well be addressed within our treaty. One of these subjects has already been mentioned also this morning. This is the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, where we have the ideal framework to start discussion on that, because we have trade, we have trade in energy materials and products, and we have a constituency where a lot of fossil fuel subsidies still exist. We modernize on 3 different levels. At the global level, it has been decided to update our political charter, the so-called European Energy Charter, which will be updated by a new charter, and which is still under discussion what it will be called. But this is a political document which gives us a global dimension. Then we also work at the regional level. We have the Northeast Asia. We have also a supergrid project about which I will still come. And then we also work, of course, at local levels, because sustainability is very much also a problem which has to be addressed at local level. Don't forget that soon more than half of the population of the world lives in big cities. So we have special programs with 4 cities to set up sustainable energy action plans in 4 of our constituent countries, and this is graciously funded by the European Commission. Just to mention the Asia Supergrid, we have started last year a project, feasibility study, pre-feasibility study, let's say, of a big project which links the different countries of Northeast Asian, the Northeast Asian continent. It comes the main driver of that initiative has been Mongolia, where we agree with my neighboring speaker that Mongolia is very interested to promote renewable energies, solar and wind. And that they are really definitely enclaved between 2 big partners, and they have to try to come out. And so we thought our organization is a useful forum to push forward a study. So we have now underway a joint regional study on what is called the Gobi Tech and the Asian Supergrid for renewable energies in Northeast Asia. That study is very strongly, as I said, supported by Mongolia. We have also other partners which have come in. We have partners from Korea, from Mongolia, from Japan, and from Russia. For the moment, you still don't see China in here, because the Chinese have said us that they are changing the leadership, not only in their state and in the government, but also in the top enterprises. So we are confident that they will come into this project in the weeks or months to come, as soon as the leadership has changed in their organizations. So we hope that by the end of this year we will have the feasibility study, pre-feasibility study made. Then upcoming events which can be interesting for Asia also. In Geneva, we will have on 28th of April a high-level workshop on the role of intergovernmental agreements, which we host jointly with the WTO, where we address all the subject of the sort of the deadlock between the different institutions working in sustainability. On one hand side, the climate convention, on the other hand side the Doha and the WTO Doha round, and on the other hand side our agreement, where we try to see who can take the initiative at this moment to move a step further. Then something new which we start in Brussels this next month is an executive training program for global energy challenges and international cooperation, where we for the first time invite people from industry and government to come to be trained as decision makers for tomorrow in all the challenges which are upcoming. Then particularly important and interesting, in September we have our annual policy conference, which this year will be in Bali in Indonesia, where we invite very much the political leaders of the region. Then in October also we have a regional forum always, which this year we will have it in the framework of the CAS Energy, where we have our regional energy cooperation forum, and we have also the local stakeholder meeting for the project I mentioned before, for local cooperation. And something which is not mentioned on the slide yet is that we are planning to have an event on the Asia Supergrid within the World Energy Council meeting in Korea, which I cannot confirm yet, but this is something which we plan to do. So I think with this I can close my presentation, and thank you for your attention.